I've secretly replaced my wife's Folgers crystals with
Orc+Bone.
Let's watch and see what happens.
Well, good morning. This is Queen Waspinator. I have your Folgers crystals.
Thank you. The hell is this?
Help your lady friends wake up the right way with Orc+Bone. It's not coffee.
Orc+Bone is an OSR setting. It was the first role-playing game I wrote. It's keyed to go off the white box rules, largely because I felt that they were kind of a little underserved in terms of like having people having written supplements to go with them. And also, you know, they're cheap, and they go hand in hand with the philosophy of less is more of the various restoration project OSRs, you could say, where they're trying to, like, you know, recreate the exact feel of some of the older box sets and such. This is my personal favorite. I like that it caps off at level 10 and all that other kind of stuff, and so it's the one I decided to go with. However, Orc+Bone, like, radically changes the kind of game it is, introduces several different classic races as playable. I give my own version of half-elves and halflings. Also provide my own version of orcs and gnolls. My version of orcs are obviously very central to the whole premise of the thing. I kind of go a bit more back to Tolkien, and that the lore of their backstory is that, like, you know, in whatever ancient war you had between the elves and the dwarves back in the end of the First Age, the dwarves had, you know, found and domesticated and educated cavemen into being like the first civilized humans, and they were kind of using them as like soldiers in their, you know, efforts to take down, you know, whatever kind of weird elf empire was going on at the time. And so the elves, a group of them who were like exceptional warriors and were super loyal to the cause and the salvation of the elven race and all that, volunteered themselves to be transformed into the first generation of orcs, where, you know, they lost some of their immortality, but you know, they were given a more robust frame and warrior capacities, and, you know, the night vision and the ability to have enhanced, you know, sense of smell and hearing and all that kind of stuff, you know, to make them more effective hunters and killers. And also in some ways, like, the orcs are like the elves' critique of what they thought of humanity too, in kind of a way, because they were supposed to be trying to make them to match human ferocity. Except, you know, the war came to an end, and whatever kind of truce or stalemate, you know, between the various peoples happened, and then various ages of time have gone on since then, and orcs were kind of abandoned. You know, when they were no longer directly useful for them, they were a bit of an embarrassment. You know, orcs jar greatly against the elven aesthetic and want for beauty and beautiful things, and orcs are very much not that. So orcs were kind of like relegated to a kind of lonely exile existence on the hinterlands of, you know, whatever the known central world is. Aside from, you know, being used occasionally by small petty tyrants on the fringes of civilization, or, you know, petty warlords and weird, you know, magicians with strange plots to want to take over the world and all that kind of stuff, they developed a reputation of being, you know, a barbaric race of, like, just ravenous killers. And whereas, you know, yes, it's very much in their nature, they're more sophisticated in their own way secretly than people give them credit for. It's not like these random tyrants and random wizards were, like, just ordering up tons and tons of armor and weapon for an orc horde out of nowhere. The orcs have their own mining and have their own manufacturing, going kind of, again, with that Tolkien flavor. Low-key, in the Tolkien universe, like, the orcs are actually among the more sophisticated technological races in terms of, like, understanding industry and all that, you know, having a process to mass-produce war goods and explosives and all that other kind of stuff. So kind of trying to bring more of that flavor back into it. The orcs were actually much more self-sufficient in terms of you know, equipping themselves to be, you know, a fearsome warrior race. They just kind of had no real direction. That the people that they would be most inclined to actually listening to wanted nothing to do with them, and, you know, over the thousands of years that burned a lot of bitter, kind of spiteful hatred towards, you know, their own creators. You know, like, orcs, like, you know, might not, like, go out of their way to, like, try to, like, wipe elves out or any of that kind of stuff, and they might generally, like, leave their settlements alone, but they despise them because they were rejected. The orcs on some level still, like, feel highly of themselves as being of the line of elves, even if they're not included anymore in any of that, you know. So like they still view humans as being lesser beings and just animals that the dwarves tamed. So they just kind of existed out there on the edge of the world, and, you know, within like the civilized lands, you know, events go along. The elves kind of drift off out, you know, beyond the borders of what is known. The dwarves at some point seal themselves up in their underground kingdoms and are never heard from again, and human civilization at that point kind of takes over, in many ways also by having like absorbed and taken some of the technology left over on the surface from the dwarves. You know, you're finally your big age of human empires. Starts off as a bunch of big kingdoms, but all eventually merges into one big thing. You sweep in a bunch of, you know, like other smaller races in terms of numbers, like all eventually just kind of like have to accept life within this human empire. It even does some oddly noble things at first, like it makes a point of like, we're gonna like take care of the dragon and giant menace, and we're gonna like free the goblins from, you know, thousands of years of servitude to hobgoblins and all that kind of stuff. Bringing goblins in as kind of like a servant class along certain coastal areas. Eventually though, at some point something goes wrong. Demon and devil worship starts to spread through the nobility of this human empire, and things get increasingly corrupt and evil across all the land. Most of the old cults and religions are kind of forgotten in place of devil worship, and there's just the very beginnings of a revolutionary sentiment from the common populace and from the few people who still practiced old pagan beliefs that, you know, we gotta, you know, rise up and overthrow this devil church and all this kind of stuff. But before that happens, one night at the stroke of midnight, humanity is anti-raptured. It's heavily implied, although it's not directly spelled out, because it should be kind of a mystery and a bit at the discretion to the specific game master exactly what you want to say happened. But the general implication is that at some point, one of these devil-worshipping human emperors had made some sort of deal, and when that deal came due, all the unmodified, uncursed, pure humans across the entire world just all up and just vanished right in the middle of whatever they were doing. Humans who had some sort of curse on them, like, you know, people who suffer from lycanthropy, people who practiced magic or had some sort of like active blessing, or had been like directly empowered through contact with a magic item, or people who had any trace of fey blood in their lineage, even if they're not directly the half-elf of being like, you know, mom and dad. One was elf, one was human. Even if they're like 10 generations removed from having an elf ancestor, just that little tiny bit of elfishness is enough to spare them from this event. But we're still talking like 50 to 70% of the population disappearing instantly. Also, you know, humans being like the bulk of like, you know, the agricultural labor force and just the general maintenance of all the cities and such. Like in a real quick fashion, like, you know, civilization just kind of collapses. The halflings and half-elves and the other peoples who are around are not enough. The magic users and other people who have had some sort of like, you know, magic imprint on them start to mutate and change and warp and go crazy. And other, you know, supernatural entities that have been hiding amongst humankind this whole time, in particular vampires, but also kind of other kinds of undead, start coming out of the woodwork. Vampires in particular, because their food sources just suddenly vanished on them. The mutant magic users aren't really quite palatable to them, but this setting, the vampires can't feed on people with fey blood. They also, orcs, elves, half-elves, they just can't deal with the taste of it. It provides them no nutrition. Optionally, if you want to like have it like a vampire feeds on a she or something like that, it could even like cause them damage, but I didn't actually specifically write anything up about that because I don't have vampire player characters in this version of Orc+Bone. They all kind of start coming out of the woodwork, and the vampires basically are just stuck with the halfling population that was living alongside as a smaller demographic within human towns and cities. As something that they could feed on. They generally in the past had kind of ignored halflings because of their size. They weren't really a satisfying meal, but now they're the only game in town, and so they start enslaving and actively breeding the halflings to, you know, be used as a food source. And soon after all this happens, word starts to filter up into the hinterlands of the north to the orcs that, you know, something's gone wrong. The human empire's fallen. Now's the time we can finally strike and raid and all this kind of stuff. And so this big, massive gathering of all the orc tribes from all across the north happens, and they march down south through the gap in the mountains that separates the heartlands from the hinterlands to the north. And they end up not like roaring into the land on horseback, or in their case, wargback, you know, to raid and pillage, because, you know, the countryside was still kind of on fire. Like, whole cities, like, you know, people just disappearing out of nowhere. Like, all sorts of fires and things were left untended. So, like, whole cities just kind of just burned down empty. The countryside's quiet. They're kind of confused as they get further and further south. And finally, as they get to the outer edges of the cities that are still standing, because vampires and other supernatural evils like liches and the mutant wizards that have kind of kept their shit together a bit better mentally, have still managed to maintain some sort of control. The orcs arrive, and to their surprise, a group of half-elves and halflings comes out to them and asks them for help freeing them. And so these orcs, who've spent years being rejected and being disregarded as just, like, you know, amongst the various monstrous trash races of the hinterlands, are suddenly put in this odd situation where, like, people are expecting them to do something, and they're given a clear foe, and they're given someone to fight on behalf of, which stirs something, like, deep in them that they haven't felt in a while. And so the orcs of Orc+Bone, it's like another 100 years after that point. You know, most of the Imperial world has kind of just entirely gone to seed, and the orcs have kind of been organized in, like, crusader armies, where they've just been moving from, like, city to city, region to region, just wiping out vampires and freeing, you know, half-elves and all that kind of stuff, and halflings as they go. And here and there in their wake, the beginnings of odd little new civilizations are starting to pop up here and there. But if you ever seen any of those shows on the History Channel about, you know, like, what the world would be like if humanity just up and vanished, and how within a couple hundred years New York City's mostly crumbled apart and turned into forest, that's kind of happening in this world. So there's a lot of open space to explore, to put mysteries, to have old ruins and treasures and lost magic items, and a reason why they're all just kind of sitting out there. The thing that's always kind of bothered me in some ways about the conceit of D&D is just the sheer amount of money that's being left around in dungeons and basements. You know, like, don't they have an economy to run? Money's probably heavily inflated in the setting, but I don't see why, you know, races who've been using coins to trade for thousands of years are just up and stop. You know, they just might want more because it's not worth as much. So, you know, there's still a reason to have treasure. This book, very much heavily modeled on this book, the original Greyhawk world setting, written by Gary Gygax. Just in terms of how, like, the setting's presented, you get, like, a brief little overview of all the various kingdoms that have risen up. And the real meat and potatoes of this actually is the really thick section on the various kind of environments that have taken over the landscape of the Heartland, what kind of encounters you can have in there. They tree off, you know, into, like, is this a, you know, a positive encounter? Is this a negative encounter? Are you finding a location? All that kind of stuff. And then what kind of things are in there, or what kind of variables you have. And through going through all that, you actually get a good chunk of what the setting actually really feels like, because you're kind of getting to know what kind of things are potentially living there for your players to find and discover. But it kind of, like, allows potentially for a bit of, like, a self-generating terrain kind of effect every time the characters move into a new, you know, hex of landscape. You know, say, like, 1 hex equals, like, 30 miles across, you know, like a day's worth of travel. Every time they enter a new one of those, if you're doing kind of a hex crawl approach, you can, like, randomly roll to see if they find, like, some sort of lost ruins, or maybe a small settlement, or, you know, come across a herd of, you know, giant buffalo, and all that kind of stuff. If there's any drawback to having nailed this to the white box rules, is that the white box rules have a pretty limited and basic amount of monsters in their monster section of the book. And so at times I did feel like maybe being a little bit repetitive with the amount of times you can run into manticores. But, you know, just as with any of these things, you know, feel free to use it as, like, a starting point, and then pull stats from other, you know, D&D supplements. Like any good OSR product, it's super compatible with most things. You don't even have to use the white box rules. You can use AD&D or D&D 5th edition. In some ways, I feel that AD&D works better, because if you bring in sages and specialists, that kind of allows you to replicate some of what I was doing with my character classes, where you also have antiquarians and blacksmiths amongst the other adventurers. There's no clerics in this setting. Like, the moment that the humans all disappeared, also, like, the gods went silent. Magic users are around, but it's highly discouraged for players to play one. Like, really only half-elves still practice the art. at least of the races described in this side of the setting, because whether or not of whatever the truth was about what happened that caused the sudden disappearance of humankind, because, you know, so many wizards remained behind but were like mutated all weirdly, not like in an X-Men kind of way, but more like a Hills Have Eyes kind of way. They've ended up like reaping a lot of the blame for why that happened. Magic is being blamed. So, you know, shamans and witches I present in here, that they kind of get a cultural pass because of the way they are employing magic, but like actual magic users aren't really encouraged. Like I said, there's like no clerics at all. Shaman characters though, you know, as they explore, you know, like what kind of spirits are out there that they can interact with, there are these kind of like newly emerging primordial unformed god entities that are still taking shape, and that their interactions with them can actually kind of lead to what kind of god they end up becoming, kind of a thing, which I feel is interesting. There's a lot of stuff like that in here that's supposed to be give you space for your own kind of in-game world building. It's a setting where, you know, like the characters very much can be the founders of civilizations. It's supposed to play into the fact that, like, you know, in these games you get to a certain level and suddenly you're able to build strongholds and start your own thieves guilds and all these other sorts of things. And so I wanted to intentionally, you know, build a game world that actually has open room in between the various established kingdoms, so that players actually could create something of their own without having to come up with some contrivance of being granted land or have to take some land from someone else in order to be able to do it. I reframe a lot of the monsters as spirits and kind of give them a few kind of extra abilities in terms of like their ability to, you know, possess things across the barrier between the worlds. In some ways, like the spirit world in this is just basically the Feywild and the Shadowfell just jammed together into one spirit dimension. And beyond that, I'm not much sure else to say. It's moody. It's an example of how to, like, you know, take a monster race like orcs and frame them as protagonists without having to negate or rewrite all of their backstory and lore, and to turn them into something that was like some sort of Pollyanna this whole time. There is an angle where they have been a bit misunderstood, but also, you know, like a good chunk of their reputation, you know, was earned deservedly by thousands of years of just being dicks out there in the wilderness. Pick a spot you like and start off there. There's actually, I feel like there's a lot of different campaign opportunities to be had. You know, are you defending one of the last little halfling civilizations that have started to arise? Are you with one of the crusading armies trying to free halflings? Are you just out exploring the wilderness? There's all the stuff with the you know, emerging kingdom of Duradia and Prince Vovo's plans to start setting up colonies and building a navy. To, you know, because, you know, from his understanding of history, of human history, you know, like that was like one of the key things that allowed the human empire to like establish dominance over such a wide area of land, was their control of naval power and the two little inland seas that kind of flanked the central area. Classic Frank Frazetta fire and ice type adventuring. There's a lot of different ways, you know, Orc and Bone can be used, and I would like you to try to explore it and let me know what you found. I'd done some videos recently going through like all the main core player races from 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, and just kind of my own personal takes on how to run them as NPCs and background characters to help kind of establish a sense of normality for your players, so that they have a frame of reference for how to like play their characters if they are one of those races. If left entirely on their own, yeah, they might not portray an elf or a tiefling or whatever it is quite the way that you imagine it as the DM. So if you want them to have even a chance to do that, they need to be provided an example, and it's easier and better to do that in-game than it is to just like give them like a pile of text to read and somehow absorb and remember, while also keeping track of all the various myriad things that one has to keep track of in your head in order to maintain the internal hologram of what's going on in the game in your head. So I wanted to do the same thing with Orc and Bone. In spite of its premise, it should like, be kind of, you know, like play it as you want. You bought the damn thing. If you want to run it however you will. But, you know, if you want my particular take on how I view the product, it's supposed to be kind of a bit more thoughtful, a take on what an orc game should be. It's not Warhammer 40k. This is not just a ravenous horde of evil people kind of a thing. I lean back more into like a Tolkien-esque, Elder Scrolls-esque kind of mythology for orcs, where they are distinctly an elven people who had been voluntarily modified so that they can fight early primitive humans, and whatever War of the Dawn Age kind of stuff that goes on in pretty much most fantasy settings. When the war was over, they weren't like reabsorbed back into elf society. They no longer fit in. They didn't fit that elitist elf aesthetic for beauty. And, their immortality was kind of robbed of them. I like to do kind of a thing in this one where orcs can live for several centuries, but because of just the brutal nature of orc existence, like, few of them actually filter through to be able to live that long. Most of them get killed in battle, kind of a Viking kind of thing. And because they are self-conscious of what they've been turned into, even all these millennia later, on some subconscious level, orcs still are elves on the inside, and so still have an appreciation for the sorts of, pursuit of beauty kind of stuff that, elves should be synonymous with. Except it's been twisted into this kind of resentful thing. So, the fact that they seek, to like find some glorious way to die in battle as opposed to linger on and on for centuries in this horrible, nasty, piggish form, I kind of feel makes sense. This is supposed to be, they're kind of moody. And because time has done for them what, their own weapons and brutality could not do, time through attrition and just their own folly has removed most of their, main, opponents from the world now. The dwarves are gone, the elves are gone, the humans are gone. Here at the end of things, orcs find themselves, the ones holding the bag. It's now their world. They're the most effective military force that can be mustered to combat the things that are still lingering over from human civilization. There should not be one common portrayal of orc society. They're in Orc+Bone. They're kind of all over the map. Some are more civilized and educated than other groups. Others are practically little more than like roving nomadic steppe plains barbarians. Although they don't go as far down as Stone Age in tech level. Orcs, in spite of their reputation, their problem isn't that they have a lack of intelligence, is that they have bad charisma, and so they're not very personable. And just because of their whole long history and the way other races in the world have viewed them, they are perceived as being dumb and brutal. But actually, they're quite sophisticated with tool use and manufacturing and all that kind of stuff. So, like, yeah, they don't go back to like Stone Age caveman kind of level. They're more like your Mongol or Turkic, Golden Horde kind of stuff. But like over time, as they've been crusading back and forth across the old remnants of the human empire, fighting vampires and other things, trying to like liberate, the halflings from being used as a domesticated food source for vampires. Some of them have like picked up like a lot of stuff from like leftover, human knowledge and technologies. And so, the orcs are different. It depends on the individual, depends on, like what kind of subculture of orc they've emerged from. There's a lot of wiggle room in terms of for game masters to kind of figure that out on their own. But orcs, aren't just nothing but like attack mode. There's that thankless hero kind of thing going on with them. They've been underappreciated for all this time, but here now, like, given a proper enemy to fight and given someone to like save, old instincts are stirred in them. And so like there's a streak of orc that is more noble in this setting than what you find in others. Also, like with the elves gone, they are all that is left of the elf. Arguably the half-elves might have, on the surface, to seem like they have more of a claim on elf culture and maintaining, elf tradition, but the orcs actually were elves. They're not humans with a drop of elf blood in them. In spite of that self-loathing that they've always had, is also built on top of the ego of being an elf. Like, they wouldn't loathe what they look like and all that kind of stuff and how brutal they've become if it wasn't in contrast to the fact that at their core, they're supposed to be this, like, beatific being of light originally, when the world was created, kind of a thing. And that's still in them. And this setting is like kind of blowing on that last remaining ember of that. And in some of them it's taken hold, but in others they haven't changed. The memory of history, the bitterness, the resentment towards humans and dwarves and elves, even though they're gone, is still there, so not all orcs are good guys now all of a sudden. This isn't an attempt to like try to retcon them into them having been good guys the entire time. It's just that there is a rationale to their attitude and some of their reputation, while like there's, you know, reasons why they developed it, it's not necessarily merited when you actually peel, you know, back the surface and see what they're really doing. Halflings are the other, you know, to go along with the orc, are probably the other most important race in the setting in terms of NPCs, more so even than player characters. They are the damsel of the setting, so to say. Even with player character halflings, it's the peril that so many halflings face in the setting as being, you know, all, you know, potentially just a food source for ancient vampires who just refuse to die. That kind of drives at least the back, even if you're off adventuring in the wilderness and not doing anything with vampires, because there's a lot, you know, lots of different things to encounter and potentially do in the setting. It's there in the background churning. It is the central core of conflict for this world, and it has, you know, shaped you know, how things have evolved since the collapse of human civilization when all of humanity disappeared. Like, not all the halflings are domesticated halflings. You know, some of them have been freed and have, like, either, you know, living alongside orcs or having gone off and created their own little new shire kind of environments. You know, some of them have kind of like, you know, reestablished themselves as like your classic halflings. However, their culture isn't quite so cheerful anymore. As a race, they've been heavily traumatized by everything that happened after humanity just kind of winked out and the vampires started enslaving them. And so they're a bit more grim and fatalistic, yet they're still themselves. It might be kind of a hard thing to portray accurately because they're not quite so extreme as like the halflings in Dark Sun or anything like that. They're not turned into like cannibalistic, you know, miniature jungle warriors or anything like that. Even though there are wild halflings in the setting, those are just halflings that have like tried to just get as far away as civilization as possible and go out and live in the forest. They're closer to like wood elves in terms of their presentation. As opposed to yeah, what they were in Dark Sun. They're not like evil wild elves. They're done with it, you know. Like if this is what living around the civilized races turns into, where like suddenly they're gone and now we're being like used as food. Like, we don't want anything of that. We're tired of farming. We're just gonna go live off in the forest and live in tents and migrate around hunting deer and horticulturally, you know, harvesting fruits and vegetables. But even then, like all of halfling kind has been heavily demoralized by the events of recent centuries and the fact that a good portion of their race is still in that condition, because there's a good chunk of the central core of the old human imperial cities that are still kind of operating, except the population is now like, you know, a large population of domesticated halflings being ruled over by vampires and a couple of liches that they've made bargains with. You know, controlling them using like, you know, undead zombies and skeletons and stuff is basically just, you know, like to keep everyone in line. And a population of like Hills Have Eyes mutants that are descended from the magic users that survived the winking out snap event that happened in the setting, and are themselves like some of the few actual active magic users that you'll find in the setting as well. And so, like, you know, it's an ever shrinking area of old empire where, you know, that has some sort of unnamed vampire emperor who's declared himself emperor, probably because they're just the vampires that was in the, you know, highest position in the imperial court at the time that everyone disappeared. And so it was the easiest for them to just kind of like slip into the throne kind of a thing. Through all that trauma, halflings have been thrust. Some of them just want to be left alone. Others, like, you know, want to like go on adventure and rebuild civilization, or, you know, take the fight back to the vampires and help free their own people. There's a lot of things you can do with the halflings, just as much with the orcs. I like there being breadth of nuance of the types of people that you can see. I know that is somewhat controversial, but, you know, as we should all, as game masters and players in general, not allow the fact that one faction is trying to tell us that we have to do things a certain way, turn it into a reflex where we're just yelling back that, no, you got to do things this way. I still would like to believe in a world where we have multiple options for how we want to go about running our own little games in the way that we want to run them. And so all options should be on the table. But maybe that's just me. Now, when I was first coming up with my original notes for Orc+Bone, when I was designing the setting, My original intention was I was going to have wargs as a playable race, turn them into more like an evolved humanoid wolf kind of thing. But then as I started to, you know, actually, you know, hammer it down and wet it to the white box rule set, they didn't really have wargs written up that way, and I didn't necessarily want to like intrude something entirely from scratch to such a fashion, so I kind of switched over to gnolls. Now, I've always been a little fond of gnolls. You know, it's different that you have like a hyena-based, you know, human-animal hybrid species running around. I do find the current 5th edition depiction of gnolls basically just makes them into a race of subdemons, practically, with their whole strange life cycle of, you know, hyenas consuming dead bodies and then a gnoll grows out of them and all that kind of stuff. Seems like if you have a gnoll problem, the key is to, like, not really worry so much about attacking the gnolls, but to make sure you wipe out all the hyenas in your region, and that'll do a lot to curb a gnoll outbreak. But I mean, you can almost like run a 5th edition, you know, gnoll story adventure, almost like some sort of zombie plague kind of thing. I'm trying to get away from that. I'm going back to them just being, you know, like creatures, flesh and blood, born from copulation, all that kind of stuff, you know. In many ways, the reputation that orcs have from other races in history is really more what should be the gnolls' reputation. They are the ones that are a lot more primitive. They can be trained easily, but their natural society is basically just to be simple nomadic, you know, hunters, less so much gatherers. They don't manufacture very much of their own goods. You know, they have functional hands, but they're still, you know, big and furry, and they have claws, so there's some kind of minor fine dexterity kind of stuff. I have it written up that they're not really good at, like, you know, firing bows with strings and all that kind of stuff. They're more prone if they're going to be using a ranged weapon to chuck a spear or use a crossbow and things like that, because it's a bit easier on their hands. But otherwise, it doesn't affect their dexterity attribute to, you know, any degree. It's because, you know, they're still fast and they can still dodge and make leaps over rivers and all that kind of stuff. The reason why they're a companion race for the orcs is kind of like just over the centuries, you know, when orcs were kind of like a roaming kind of mercenary race being used by various, you know, fringe tyrants and wizards to try to pull off various plots of conquest and world-ending doom. The orcs would often be paired up with gnolls. The gnolls would kind of like, you know, work under them as scouts and shock troops, whereas the orcs were, you know, the more sophisticated tacticians and field soldiers and such like that. And so when the orcs all come down into the fallen empire of man at the beginning of the Orc and Bone setting, they have gnolls with them, and as they've gone on their little orcish crusades to liberate halfling kind from the vampires and other evil things that reside in the ruins of the old human cities, the gnolls have come with them, and they're starting to get a little bit more sophisticated. When left to their own devices, they still tend to fall back on simple little tribal clan, family pack kind of units that will typically be matriarchal, and running with the idea that these are hyena creatures. They're kind of more of like a long-lost Ice Age hyena as opposed to like modern equatorial dwelling hyena species we have in our own modern world. So bigger, shaggier, hardier, more prone to like living out on an open plain and preferring colder climates as opposed to like being like a forest dwelling kind of species or anything like that. But amongst, you know, orcs, you know, they'll show discipline, they'll show loyalty to whoever's like the most, you know, dominant force. If whoever their commanding officer is like taken out in a battle, they are prone to scattering, unless like an even like higher ranking, stronger commanding officer comes through and keeps them all in line. They make like surprisingly good rangers, and the way I have rangers written up in this, because they have like the on top of just the ranger abilities, they also have, you know, natural tracking abilities because their enhanced sense of smell and hearing. Like in some ways, probably more than anything else, they're actually closest to being the elf of this setting, if you're going for kind of like a wild elf kind of vibe. Wargs I do keep around, and they do need to be like considered, you know, like in your adventure and world presentation, because in many ways they've replaced the horse. You know, since humanity's gone and halflings are the size they are, really only half-elves really care for horses anymore, and so like there's a lot of wild horses in the northern steppe plains and whatnot, but you don't really see a whole huge amount of horses being domesticated and raised anymore. In place of that are the wargs, which are large subsentient wolves that orcs had been breeding for centuries up in the north, and now you see both wargs that are integrated into battle units and wargs that have been able to just go off and go wild and kind of take over those niches. You see them partner up with wild gnolls. You see them being used as mounts and trained war animals by the orcs. Also, they'll hang out with werewargs. Werewargs are basically descendants of werewolves. As described, when the humans disappeared, the humans that had some sort of magical curse on them or other kind of magical effect or magical ancestry did not disappear, and instead a lot of them mutated. Well, in the case of lycanthropes, it just kind of threw them into being permanently stuck in that man-wolf hybrid form. And there's enough of them because, like the late human empire was pretty corrupt, and like a lot of the noble families and such had, like intentionally, corrupted themselves for power and all that kind of stuff, blah, blah, blah. So there's enough werewolves that they were able to kind of establish a minor amount of a stable breeding population, and so the current werewargs are the descendants of those werewolves who survived the snap. They're kind of like almost like reverse werewolves in that they stay in like to borrow the term from Werewolf the Apocalypse, they stay in their Krenos form, where they're large and hulking and vaguely humanoid and big gnarled clawed hands and all that, except on the full moon. Then they can revert back to their human form. Also, when werewolves are alone with each other, they can regain their human form and communicate properly. But as soon as they realize that anybody else is like looking at them or has come across their little meeting, they'll suddenly all instantly revert back into the werewolf form and go nuts and go on a killing spree and all that kind of stuff. They're not really written up in a way that like player characters could be one. Also, though, the lycanthropy curse is no longer spread by bite. It's now like purely just like a bloodline thing amongst them. So, like, player characters at least don't have to worry about that. You don't have to worry about becoming a gnoll werewolf or however the hell that would work. Wargs do hang out with the werewargs too. They're kind of like a fairly common animal species. Like I said, subsentient. They have a grasp of human language, but they can't themselves talk. But they're better at like communicating their wants and needs as like a standard modern dog is for sure, and much more like clearly actually really understanding what you're saying, not just having slowly learned to associate certain mouth noises with certain tasks and stuff like that. They actually can understand the intent behind the words, and also like read people's vocal inflections and stuff like that. There's a chance like a warg would understand that you're lying to it in a way that a dog would never catch on to. If you're like having player characters buy a warg riding animal or something, like it's because of the fact that I did attach this to the white box rules. There are some things like equipment costs and costs for riding animals that I don't list in here. Use your own judgment. I would generally think that because of the extra enhanced abilities in terms of their ability to guide themselves and make their own decisions, and the increased capacity to follow more intricate orders and self-monitor themselves, that wargs would probably cost at least 2 to 3 times as much as a fully trained, fully grown warhorse, if not more. You want it to be like not entirely unreasonable. There's a good amount of them, so it's not like buying a Pegasus or a Griffin where there's a limited commodity kind of a thing. But yeah, like you'll want to make a point that of depicting like most riding forces, most cavalries and mounted strike forces that you find in this setting are wolf riders as opposed to horse riders. On the off chance that you might be sick and tired of Wizards of the Coast, Dungeons & Dragons, and their rule system, might I recommend
Stewards and Obstacles, the only tabletop role-playing game adventure that allows you to take on the role of stewards of the world's most inclusive role-playing game, to fight hateful content and fully monetize your players.
For use with the Total Party System Rules Handbook.
Available now on DriveThruRPG and Amazon.com.